One of the most important things you should do is stop believing in your own bullshit. I think the best way to judge, right, whether some meat is there is actually Y Combinator application, right? And that is why I think even when people don't make it to Y Combinator or YC, they still come up having learned something about their own business. It is almost a sort of myth that passes from one cohort to cohort in terms of what happens in Zoom chat, because Zoom chat is our backbench.
Hi everyone. I'm really happy to welcome Aditya Kulkarni today on this podcast. Aditya is the founder of Stoa, a serial entrepreneur, and an alumni from IIM Bangalore and BITS Planning. On this podcast, we talk about how Stoa was almost a teenager well-being company that became an Alt-MBA, and how you can actually hack your way through Stoa's admission process by figuring out what they look out for. Where does the idea of Stoa come from? Especially looking at your pedigree, for example, right? You have, for lack of a better word, a very conventional pedigree, engineering plus MBA types. And that too from one of the best colleges in both of them, like BITS, IIMs, both of them. So for somebody who's gone through that best of the best colleges, has gone through that conventional education combination, how did you come across this idea of starting an alternative business education ecosystem? Is it coming more from your educational background, or is it coming more from the startups that you did, or the business creation that you did over the number of years after college?
Yeah. No, so right out of IIM Bangalore, I got into education, right? So the first company I started was a B2B edtech company trying to sell to schools. And in that process, I came across all these homeschooling movements and alternative learning and J. Krishnamurti School of Thinking, the Valley School, etc. So from that time, I was exploring sort of alternative learning, primarily in the K-12 space. And after having spent like about 7-8 years in K-12 and basically not made much money, is when I decided to, in fact, Stoa, the legal company, started as a teenager well-being company because the job that I was doing before that, I created India's first socio-emotional well-being curriculum for children from grade 3 to 8 or 9. And this I did with one of J. Krishnamurti's students.
Interesting.
So in that process, met all of these homeschoolers, the learning societies and conference. And when I left that job, the idea was, let me start an alternative learning space again in K-12 space. But after, sort of really measuring my own patience with, I had gotten married or so then I decided to sort of explore beyond K-12. And even then I started as a B2C teenager well-being company. And then the pandemic hit, and then the coding moved online, schools moved online, coaching moved online. And then children simply did not have time to invest in something like an emotional well-being sort of course or curriculum of sorts. And then parallelly I had met Raj. And Raj, after getting out of BITS, he had also set up an alternative learning space in Goa. So our backgrounds were in exploring these alternative learning formats, primarily in offline space. In the first 6 months of that exploration, after Raj and I started working together, was running these bunch of experiments around, hey, how can we help other people create online learning communities? So it's to run a podcast called Learning Communities Podcast. Shelton, who still works for Stoa, he was the host. And we interviewed a bunch of people. The person who helps David Perel run Rite of Passage, John Danner, a bunch of these interesting people who were building learning communities. The cohort-based courses as a term came after Gagan and Wes started Maven, right? But before that, the word that was popular on Twitter was learning communities. And what we understood was, we understand what brings people together for learning and why those communities sustain. And some of the earliest experiments we ran were actually offering this as a service to other people, saying, hey, we wrote to a bunch of YouTubers saying, boss, you have not been able to monetize your audience really well because you're, what is that platform that YouTube uses for monetize? Patreon. Your Patreon earnings don't match up to your followership. So why don't we create a learning community? We actually scraped a list of about 2,000 YouTubers, wrote to them. Nobody sort of responded. And then we moved on to, catching up with other people. So we tried helping about 4 or 5 people. And in that process, we realized that for a learning community to be really successful, somebody has to give really 100% of, like, it can't be the third or fourth thing
Right.
in your life. So if you're running a branding agency, you're CEO of that,
Right.
then you'll take forever to build that community because it always gets deprioritized. And that is how the idea of Stoa sort of came about. Ki fir apni hi bana lete hain, right? Let's start our own learning community.
Interesting. When the first cohort came up, right? How difficult was it to kind of get those early believers?
It wasn't actually that difficult, and I'll tell you the reason for that. Our fundamental insight about Stoa came from working with these 2-3 people about learning communities. In fact, we were working with this yoga entrepreneur in Bangalore, and she runs a pretty big studio. And she came up with this idea that let's create a curriculum for these yoga certified trainers to help them build yoga business. And her point was there are about 1.5-2 lakh yoga certified trainers now, but a lot of those people don't know how to run business. And the words that she was using, right? They don't know how to have their voice. They don't know how to do the pricing, how to do the group classes versus the one-to-one coaching. And to me, it sounded like these are all MBA concepts, right? Like you're talking about pricing, you're talking about brand voice, etc., etc. So that is how the genesis was. Our initial insight was there is scope for MBA for X, which means a lot of people need business education, but they don't need MBA. For example, if you're a Shopify store owner, you just want to know how to do inventory right. You just want to know how to do brand right. You don't need to learn about the quantitative mathematical methods of, a lot of that stuff. Maybe MOQ and all of that. But so your business education needs are really limited.
Correct.
You don't need an MBA. So that is how that initial insight was that MBA for X ho sakta hai. And then we went down that rabbit hole to understand what are the personas where MBA for X could succeed. And our research, basically, we ended up concluding that the market is in US, not in India at all. Because you have about 2 million Shopify store owners in US. You have a bunch of church leaders who manage huge amounts of money in US. You have these primary care physicians, right, who run their own clinics. 33% of primary care physicians run their own clinic, which means they need to negotiate with insurance providers and a bunch of those things. So all those personas seem to be in US, not so much in India. And then I remember this John Danner, who then later became investor in Stoa. We were jamming with him, and we would catch up every 2 weeks. And both Rajan and us, we reached the same conclusion. That he reached the conclusion saying the idea is, then he wrote a Medium blog on that MBA for X idea, but we are not the right people to build for it. And we also reached the same conclusion saying, idea to acha, but we are not the right people to build this business. And then next day morning when I woke up, and I just called Raj and I said, chalo MBA for X to nahi ho sakta, but we were seeing what Seth Godin was doing with Alt-MBA. There was also a school in London called Jolt. There was Power MBA in Spain. So we had seen some of these models, and then we said, hey, why not alternative MBA for India, right? Like, is there? And then we went on this whole user research journey of trying to understand who that persona might be.
Right. Interesting. So I think for new founders or for student entrepreneurs who are just starting with these things, what would your advice be in terms of mental models or frameworks? How can they think about these things to be able to identify what's the right opportunity that they should pursue as individuals given their background stories and all?
Yeah, I think the best way to judge, right, whether some meat is there is actually Y Combinator application, right? And that is why I think even when people don't make it to Y Combinator or YC, they still come up having learned something about their own business and their own idea through that application process. Because when you're forced to write in a very structured way about your idea and assuming like you're pitching to someone else, in that process you realize but the trick there, and I had a friend in my last job, he was also an entrepreneur. He said something very interesting to me. He said, if you're an early stage founder, one of the most important things you should do is stop believing in your own bullshit, right? Because you make up this world in your head saying कि अरे ऐसा इतना time होगा और फिर ऐसा होगा फिर ऐसा होगा फिर ये होगा. And his advice to me was be very dispassionate with whatever you are evaluating. And that is where I think mentors play a big role. People who have been through that journey and who who have learned the lessons the hard way.
I think the ability to just zoom out and say, "Acha, I like this more in my head than what the reality is."
And I mean, it's a trap, right? Like you have to constantly, like, even if I reflect on 2 years of Stoa journey now, we have fallen in that trap a number of times. Right? And you realize in hindsight, we were in our head. We believe too much in what we were saying, and we were not listening to users as much.
Interesting. So, like, I can't help but ask you this, because I was just listening to a podcast earlier this week where somebody was talking about, having this irrational passion as a founder. And that also often gets talked about, of saying that, you really need to have a very strong conviction as a founder, because markets go up and down, there are funding winters and whatnot. But as long as you believe in the problem that you're solving and you have a conviction there, you will go for it.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one narrative. And the other is what we're just discussing, is to say that you need to be able to detach yourself from it. You need to be dispassionate about it in some sense, so that you're not kind of getting trapped in what's playing in your head. So between these two, right, which are kind of almost opposing views.
I think there is a very interesting quote that we discuss often at Stoa, is when a great manager meets a shitty market, the market wins, right? Like the iron law of market.
Yeah.
And I think there are different founders and they build companies different way, right? And it is highly reflective of the personal values that they have in their life. And there is no right way per se.
Right.
But fundamentally, building a business comes down to, you can't escape the reality of the market.
Correct.
Right? So when I'm saying that you have to be very dispassionate and you need to evaluate what you are trying to do, I'm primarily saying from the point of view is there a market in the first place? Now, oftentimes there is market, sometimes that is not even sufficient for a VC, VC kind of business. So that also is another layer of awareness, right? Like, is this a VC?
Is this a VC business, or this is something that I would do as a lifestyle business, or this is like a dhanda that I can set up, which is a profitable business, but probably will not scale the way I would want it to be, or the way the VCs would want a business to be. Got it. So, ठीक है. So यहाँ तक हुआ, you guys kind of got convinced of what you wanted to do through some elimination method. Now, when it came to, let's say, creating first few cohorts of Stoa, right? What were the stories there? Just any fond memories?
What was very interesting about our founding team, right? Like, so of course I was there. Then Raj was there. Manoj, who was my BITS batchmate, and he reached out once, we sort of put out publicly that we are doing Stoa, and he was looking for opportunities in education. Is we all brought different sort of competencies to the table. And when it came to marketing in the initial days, Raj had sort of built his audience on Twitter over the past 2 years, etc. So when we I remember the date, October 2nd, 2020, when we put out that tweet saying this is what we are doing and this is what we are launching and this is the brand name and this is the logo, within next 7 days we had 1,000 people, 1,000 leads, right? And the first cohort was supposed to be about 20 people. So there was scarcity built in the announcement, but we did receive 1,000 leads. And in fact, our first 2 cohorts got filled up just through that first 7-day lead pool.
Got it.
And then, of course, your sort of program has to deliver on what you're saying, right? Like what ended up happening with our cohort 1 was we actually wrote the copy. If you go on Web Archive and see the copy was written for engineers who want to move out of coding. But the leads were like, that persona was not there in the leads at all.
Right.
It was people who were already in business roles, people who felt that business education can actually help them do better at their work, etc., etc. And that first cohort was very diverse. I remember a few names, right? Like Tanvi was there. She was running Filter Coffee. We had Ashita, who was working at Mahindra. We had Kashyap, who was running his family business, a very big family business. We had Ishan, who was working at McKinsey. So that first cohort itself was so diverse, right? And I think that also, that set the sort of Stoa as a, like whatever little brand it is there on social media, happened because of that cohort 1. Because those 26, 27 people were interesting. It was an interesting bunch, very diverse.
And so if you were to kind of look back at that cohort of saying, it was a very interesting and diverse set of people, to now that as you've scaled up, right? And earlier we were also talking about how do you create that right filtering mechanism to say, okay, who are these students that kind of fit the cultural or the value aspects of what Stoa has to offer, and who might not be a good fit for the community that Stoa is trying to build. How does that work? And what was that like when you were trying to build, let's say, the first few cohorts versus how is it now?
Yeah. So in terms of diversity, I don't think anything has changed. The kind of diversity might have changed. So for example, our cohort 9, which started in September, and this was the second time we were doing offline induction. I was surprised to see people from Bhilwara, Bharuch, Gadchiroli, Karad, Satara, Sangli, Coimbatore, Vijayawada. So it is still a very diverse cohort. It may not be the same kind of diversity that cohort 1, because cohort 1 was still very metro, right? So one of the reasons the diversity works within Stoa is also because of the way the admission process works. And we don't eliminate people for their past academic record, right? Our way of evaluation is first understanding what goal this person has in their mind of why do they even want to join Stoa, right? Whether we can deliver on that promise. Now, there are people who come to Stoa definitely for career transition, but actually 70% of our cohort comes to Stoa not for career transition at all. They come purely for learning about business, and they want to evaluate whether they can be founders in the long term or not, right? And by founder, I don't mean some VC backed stuff. They may want to start something of their own, a small thing, maybe an agency, a services company. So 60-70% of our cohort still comes just for without any outcome expectation. When I say outcome, I mean career outcome expectation. So the first thing we want to understand is whether we can deliver on the goal that this person has for them. A lot of times that goal is just about getting clarity, because today we are inundated with so much choice. Right? Like you are hearing about all these fancy things: product manager, founder's office, content strategist, influencer, growth marketer, growth hacker. Cycle hai har cheez ka, right? Like one title becomes aspirational, then another thing. So people are also seeking clarity. Is this even for me? Right? Like, will I succeed in this? So clarity is one of the most important goals that people actually come to Stoa for, right? And that is why coaching within Stoa works. One of the things we have consistently heard across all our graduation is the number of times people mention the effect coaching had on them and how it helped them build clarity. In the admission itself, we are just doing basic vibe check. What do I mean by vibe check? We are trying to see if this person is curious. Because the other proxy for curiosity is, are they obsessed about something else, if not business? Because what we have seen is, if you're obsessed about something, let's say it is music, it is sports, it is cricket, it could be anything. That obsession often translates into curiosity about business. And those people stay, engaged until the end because they are fundamentally obsessed people. So curiosity, obsession is one thing we look for. The second is ambition, right? Ultimately, any educational brand gets built when your alums or your graduates do well in the long term. So you need people who are also ambitious in their own ways. And by ambition, I don't mean that they want to go and join a McKinsey or BCG always. That ambition could be, I want to sort of run my Instagram handle and really make it big. That ambition could be, hey, I want to build a social impact or a not-for-profit sort of thing, right? So ambition is the second thing. And then the third thing is humility, right? Like, so one of the things we do check for is how this person treats our admissions team. Because that is a pretty good predictor of how valuable they are going to be as a member of our Stoa's community. Ki jab cohort chalu hoga, so how are they going to treat us? Because the pedagogy depends a lot on teamwork. And this teamwork is remote, right? Like we are still a primarily an online only program, which means when the Zoom call happens and let's say the assignment is running late into the night, is this person going to show up? How are they going to treat the other person? Even if they're not going to turn up, will they care to inform others that I'm not going to be there, right?
So I think in terms of pedagogies, like you're discussing, right? Again, I'll go back to the bits and IM thing that you've seen the best of business education, you've seen the best of engineering education versus the pedagogy that you are using now at Stoa. How different is that? What are the different methodologies you've used? You mentioned about Zoom calls, right? We've all seen, be it office meetings, be it school classrooms, people hiding behind mute and shutting down the cameras. So how has Stoa kind of tackled that, or it is that?
So especially with respect to classes, right? I think Zoom chat at Stoa is a thing of itself, right? Because and somehow that culture got built, right? Like it is almost sort of myth that passes from one cohort to cohort in terms of what happens in Zoom chat, because Zoom chat is our backbench, right? So class chal raha hai, whatever, debrief is happening, presentations are happening. But the Zoom chat is a thing in itself. So even when people are off camera, and that does happen, right? Because I think we are also coming out of a period of 2 years where everybody is also very tired of putting themselves in front of camera all the time.
Right.
But Zoom chat to us is a pretty good indicator whether people had fun in the class. Learning is a separate thing, of course. But whether they had fun is very indicative from the Zoom chat. Ki Zoom chat mein kya hua? About pedagogy itself, right? Like, so what we have consciously done, because we had, see, the thing with any online course, especially for working professionals, is the currency that you're working with is time.
Correct.
Because these people are going to office Monday to Friday, they have their own lives. Apart from your course also, they have their own lives. And we are a very weekend heavy course.
Correct.
And compared to most other online courses, we demand a lot more time. Right? Like, so typically your courses will demand about 4-5 hours. Over the weekend, we demand about 10-12 hours. So we have to be very conscious that these 10-12 hours, people need to get the same high or the same dopamine hit that they would get from, let's say, watching or binge watching Netflix.
Right.
So the pedagogy is largely driven by people solving real business problems, right? So that is where we work with a bunch of these companies, a bunch of these operators to bring these problems, and then we debrief these people on Saturday morning about the problem. They have 24 hours. So there is that time scarcity in which they need to work with teams or individually to submit the solution by Sunday. And then the Sunday is largely about like seeing what are the top presentations, getting feedback from operators on like what went right, what went wrong, them explaining how they would have approached the same problem, and then Q&A. Now, the problem with this structure is you don't have any time to teach theory. And that we have solved by basically Monday to Friday. We now have a dedicated team of writers, which simplifies, right? Like if I have to, let's say, talk about content marketing, I have a team of writers who will only work on making sure that those 5 days of content, I have 15 minutes of reading time from this person. And how do I deliver 75 minutes? How do I make sort of summarize or, abstract content marketing in 75 minutes of reading time? Because that is the time I get from Monday to Friday.
Correct.
And our course structure, rather, it is not a course structure, right? It is a concept structure. Which means every week we fundamentally cover 1 or 2 concept areas. There is no marketing course at Stoa, no product course at Stoa. And that keeps things engaging, because if you are a learner at Stoa, this week you might be playing a data analyst. The week after that, you're playing a content marketer. The week after that, you're playing a product manager. The week after that, you might be playing something else. So it also keeps you surprising. It's, it's role playing across whatever these 24 sprints. So playing 24 different roles. Now, of course, some sprints are more theoretical than others. Right? Like microeconomics, you can't do much there. Right? Like that is the constant. But what ends up happening is people end up putting themselves in shoes of these 18-20 roles, and that also serves the purpose about like getting clarity. What do I enjoy? In fact, I was having a conversation with one of our Cohort-8 fellows. We did the first mentoring call, and he basically said, Aditya, I'm an analyst at Deloitte, and I'm only open to, I'm only considering product and BizOps roles. And I was like, what about marketing? And he was like, no, I don't think I'm creative and this and that. I said, why don't you wait it out? Go through some 2-3 marketing sprints, and then we can have this conversation again. And I had this conversation just day before with him. He said, Aditya, now I want to wait, right? Like I want to give this more chance. And that has happened so many times at Stoa, right? Like in our cohort 1, we had this guy, he's preparing for CFA, hardcore finance guy. And we started the marketing sprint. It was a small cohort, very cozy kind of feeling. And he said, Aditya, marketing to karna nahi. And I said, why? What is the? He said, my girlfriend was a marketeer and she dumped me. Marketers I absolutely hate, right? Like, and now he happens to be a brand manager. Right? Like he got out of Stoa. CFA, VFA सब पीछे रह गया.
Hopefully found a new girlfriend.
Yeah. In fact, of course, he got a new girlfriend, and he then got his girlfriend's sister to join Stoa, right? So this also happens within Stoa. I mean, we were doing this VC pitch meeting very early in the days of Stoa, and one of these VCs very jokingly said ki, Aditya, you're not getting the job to be done for an MBA, which is, people go there because that is the last chance you can find a partner for life. Right? Like that is why people go for a master's. कि उसके बाद निकल गए तो फिर बड़ा मुश्किल है, right? Like हमारे यहाँ पे थोड़ा उल्टा हुआ है, where people have gotten their girlfriends or their boyfriends to join the next cohort. कि now I have become part of this community and I also want you to be part of this community. तो अभी तो शादियां हो रही है, but I mean, not to Stoa's credit, they were already dating before they came to Stoa.
But you're steadily moving in that direction.
Yeah.
Interesting. When you look at, let's say, Stoa's strategy for the coming years, what kind of role you see content playing in there, social media presence playing out there, especially with respect to acquiring new students or building that brand voice that you spoke about earlier?
Yeah. No, I do think not just for Stoa, right? Like I think in general for every brand, content is going to be a key marketing sort of thing, right? Like because that is a channel where you know what your costs are, because those costs are primarily about employing few people, coming up with strategy and executing it. And content has a much better half-life compared to any other, like, you turn off the tap on ads,
Correct.
You stop getting new customers. But you put out content on YouTube, which is really great. That content has a very long half-life, right? I think YouTube video probably has the highest half-life. Then is maybe LinkedIn posts, Reels, maybe Reels also, I don't know.
And podcasts, hopefully.
And podcasts. Yeah. So content has much better half-life. It also allows you to project to the outside world who you truly are.
Right.
And it is very easy to fake if you're just putting few pieces of content out. But if you're consistently putting content out, you can't really, you have to be your authentic, true self. And ultimately, what we also stay within Stoa is people buy from people. People are not buying Stoa, right? Like they are oftentimes buying in because they like Aditya, they like Raj, or they like Manoj, or they like Sukita, or whoever they have interacted in one of our events, or maybe they have come across their LinkedIn. So that way, I do think content is going to play a large role. Like even for SaaS companies, I now see that everybody will try to take the HubSpot route. Because I think HubSpot was probably the first sort of company that did content on the scale, that they did. So, in fact, our bet is content is going to be a very critical part of everyone's marketing engine, right? And it's a pretty effective channel.
Correct. And I think we've seen that shift already happening to a certain extent. Okay. So, like we've kind of discussed of getting the cohort up and running and it's being there, right? Now, talking about within a cohort, right? There's been the shift to the charter model that you've done. Share more around why and how has that helped, and also what exactly kind of goes on once a cohort is up and running. So we've discussed the pedagogy that you follow, but you can share some stories of actual incidents from cohorts. I think that would be helpful.
Yeah. So the charter idea came about. I mean, we were mulling over that idea for about 6-9 months, right? Before we sort of committed to saying, and that is why we took pause between cohorts saying, let us do this, right? Charter idea had two fundamental sort of, perspectives to it. The first was accountability. See, you need an entry gate and an exit gate. For any educational program to have some sort of signaling value to outside employers. And that is where the second perspective comes. How do I signal to employers that people who have been through Stoa are good enough?
Right.
And employers demand that there is some measure of accountability, right? Like it is not enough that, because if you just stay a course or if you just stay a program, the problem is over time as you expand as a business, there are going to be people who will go through the program, will not probably put in the effort, but still claim the same signal that everyone else is claiming. So charter was an idea saying, hey, we don't want the exit gate because, that is the typical MBA model. But if we have to deliver this program and still maintain signal for employers, there needs to be an exit gate. And that is where the charter idea came about, right? Now, within the program, what happens is once people join, we do the 3-day in-person induction in Bangalore. Those 3 days are a lot of fun, right? Like it's again intense learning, but also fun kind of thing. And the idea of the induction, introducing that was online. Our understanding was it takes about 6 weeks for you to become friends with at least 2-3 people within the cohort. You put people offline in 3 days, they go away having built like 5 friendships, right? Like the offline, the hierarchies, who is like me, who do I like, all of that gets sorted in about 3 days very quickly. So people become friends faster. Then they start going through these different sprints, as I said, right? Like, and what we typically see is there is, of course, a dip midway through the program, because there is fatigue and people are managing work, all of that. But then it picks up towards the end again, right? Like the typical dip is very obvious, finance, right? Like these very data heavy or like numbers heavy sprints is where you would see, some retention issues. But overall, over 6-month period, we see about 80% retention, right? So which means 80% people are still turning up for every weekend.
So yeah, I think you just on that piece of signaling, right? We know that degrees used to be this filtering criteria that used to be there earlier for employers to say you have XYZ degree, and then for a very long time it has been certain institutes or pedigree to say coming from an so and so academic institute, it kind of works for me, right? As we kind of move forward, do you see degrees becoming obsolete? Do you think they've already become obsolete? Like what's the future for degrees, so to say, or for traditional education, so to say? And while at one end we're saying that, education is becoming more flexible and you don't really necessarily need a particular degree from a particular college. But when we talk about these signaling methods, right, it also becomes kind of important to have some kind of a filtering mechanism.
Correct.
So like it's a dilemma of sorts.
So the way I look at degrees have been the traditional broker between talent and opportunity, right? You have people who are talented, who have certain skills. They are seeking certain opportunities. Now, whoever is hiring for those opportunities also wants some sort of broker in between to say whether if I'm making a mistake, if I'm not making a mistake. And degree has been the traditional broker between talent and opportunity. Now, there will have to be some broker, right? Like, I don't think that there is going to be a utopian society ever where there is going to be no broker in between. Now, that broker could be a degree. That broker could be something like a charter, which is, and charter is not a new concept, right? Like you have CFA, you have CA, all of those charter systems have existed before. But you need a broker in between, right? And I think courses make for a very bad broker. Because the agreement with courses, you pay, you join the course, but whether you have really put in the effort, or whether you made it, I mean, the traditional way filtering happens is it is about perseverance, right? Like IIT is about perseverance more than like, I would say whether you're really motivated, ambitious. I don't think or what will happen once you join that. But IITs do test for perseverance. Similarly, I think CAT is the best example of a test that tests for perseverance, because CAT considers your 10th marks, it considers your 12th marks, it considers your undergraduate, it considers your CAT, it considers your experience. So CAT is one of the best tests of perseverance, right? And there are different, but the point is there are different ways, right? Like there are late bloomers. There are people who might not have shown that perseverance early in their career, but now because of some happenstance or some, having a great manager at work, they have sort of shifted orbits and shifted trajectories. But what is that broker is important. So degrees essentially were, and I don't think degrees are going to go away, right? I know there is a narrative on LinkedIn and Twitter and all of that, but I personally don't think degrees will go away, because ultimately people also want simple mental models in their life, right? Like if I'm a hiring manager, I don't want to sit around and evaluate, because I don't have that much time to evaluate every single person on their individual merit. So I'm looking for proxies. Now that proxy may be a degree, that proxy may be certain charter, CFA for example. If you're going for finance role, CFA is a proxy saying, अच्छा 3 level कर लिए, 4 साल घिसाया है तो ठीक है, this person must be good. So you need these proxies from a hiring manager perspective.
So the broker will always exist. Who's the broker, that might change.
Or maybe there might be multiple brokers, right? Like there might be multiple signals or multiple brokers in the market. And I think internet is what it is facilitating is it is allowing these newer models of experimentation around who can be a broker and who can be who can stay honest broker in the long term. Because the problem in being a broker is your incentives can trip. If your incentives slightly go towards the hiring manager, then the consumers start distrusting you. If your incentives are towards consumers because consumers are paying you, then your hiring managers don't trust you as much. So who is the honest broker? Like that is the question.
I think the honest brokers are the ones who will stay in the long run.
Yes.
So Very interesting, and I think it's very rare that I think I've never heard of degree as a broker, but yeah, interesting perspective. You mentioned about fatigue also in the online courses, right? And I think that's another problem that we've seen very common in cohort-based courses, especially the ones that happen online, is that, there is that initial enthusiasm, like very similar to a gym membership, for example. And then as you kind of go into the program, it gets more demanding. You see that into coming down, the number of hours being put in coming down. So how do you solve for that at Stoa, and how has that been addressed?
Yeah. So see, I think the framing is slightly framing needs to be slightly different, right? A lot of impact that cohort-based courses have is actually invisible even to the people who are running the cohort-based courses. Okay. For example, we have often seen that this person did not seem engaged and so on and so forth. And then they would come for graduation and say what a fantastic time they had at Stoa. And the reason is everybody chooses what value they want to pick from a cohort-based course because, for example, within Stoa, there are so many different things happening. And, if you're tracking some metrics and you have put like, oh, itna engagement hona chahiye, weekend pe itne log aane chahiye, itne logon ne feedback diya, nahi diya, kitne logon ne coaching session kiya, mentoring session kiya. If you track those metrics, you will always feel sad. Because you're like, मैं इतना effort डाल रहा हूँ, and why are these people not realizing that this is in their interest?
Correct.
But then what you will realize is they choose where they see value. So we've had people in our cohorts who purely derived value from talking to so many people. They're the best network people. Soumya Saxena from our cohort, he's the best. He was a strategy guy at Vartana. Okay. He had no need probably for a Stoa kind of course. But he joined in, and I don't think when he joined in, he had any thought of leaving Vartana in his mind at all. But it so happened by the end of Stoa's journey, he had suddenly become interested in Web3. He left his job. He then became an Antler fellow. And he's in his own journey. One of the best networked person within Stoa. And we have seen so many people, right? Like when they joined, they did not have an agenda. But as they went through the process, they saw these. They decided what are the pockets of value that they want to sort of double down on, right? And they derived value from that. One of our cohort 5 fellows, Kanika, when she joined again, like it was like, oh, let me just do Stoa and see what happens. By the end of it, she realized that I don't want to do corporate. I don't even want to do startups.
Got it.
I'm happy being a coach. And it is difficult, right? Like if you are the course designer or your program director, it is very difficult because oftentimes it is frustrating कि यार ये ऐसे क्या क्यों नहीं कर रहे हैं लोग, right? Like, and I'm tracking these metrics,
right?
And these metrics also become their own game, right? Like अगर ये बोल दो कि attendance होना चाहिए, ये metric है,
right?
Then you will start sending some WhatsApp reminders. You will start,
correct.
You do some attendance,
correct,
and then that metrics becomes the game. So online attendance is a very poor metric because you can log in Zoom.
Right.
You can keep the video on and you can just walk away, right? So ultimately, whatever metrics you choose, they lead to some weird games, right? And we have realized this at Stoa also. So now our approach is, let us see whether there is value in it. And whoever wants to derive value, let them derive value from it. But we will set program culture. We will set program expectations. We will tell people upfront, and this we have done since our cohort 1. The first thing we say is we are going to treat you like adults, right? So if you're not going to behave like adults, I'm not going to come and remind you and poke you, and we end up doing that sometimes. But we do set these expectations upfront, saying we are going to treat you like adults. You're no more children. You're working professionals, and it is up to you to derive value. हमको तो पैसा मिल गया because we are not on ISA model. हमको जो पैसा देना था आपने दे दिया है. अब it is your responsibility to hold us accountable.
Right. And also I think you were talking about how do you make sure that people, or how do you kind of motivate people to not miss a class?
Yeah. So this actually happened during my IMB times, right? Like I was calculating, 14 lakh रुपए fee है, 6 semesters per semester, कुछ 2 lakh plus 6 courses है, हर course का कुछ 10 session है या whatever, right? And I calculated कि कुछ 2000 रुपए value आता है per class का.
Right.
So I never missed a class in IMB after I had done that calculation. And that is what I say at Stoa also. I give them a calculation कि अच्छा इतने 24 वीकेंड है, 28 वीकेंड है, इतने घंटे का क्लास है, तो तुम कैलकुलेट कर लो कि कोचिंग का इतना पैसा निकल लिया, मेंटरिंग का इतना निकल लिया, करियर का इतना निकल लिया, तो पर क्लास कितना पैसा है, एनीबडी कैन कैलकुलेट. but वो थोड़ा उल्टा भी पड़ जाता है, you know, because I have seen in some cases that person will come back and say, Aditya, you said at orientation कि per class this and this class was not good, so my money is मेरा पैसा खराब हो गया,
2000 रुपए
वापस कर दो.
Interesting. So I think earlier you were talking about, offline it takes, let's say, people 3 days to kind of form those bonds, whereas online, let's say, it might take them 6 weeks or so. And there's been that debate of online versus, like, during COVID, it became online. Then there's a lot of conversation around hybrid. And then you also see a lot of leading tech players, so to say, going into purely offline models or acquiring offline companies. So what are your thoughts on this online versus hybrid versus offline kind of a thing? And what do you see is scaling up in the future? To see क्या ये होगा?
I think the answer is not from a business model design of the founder or the business that is operating. You have to look at it from a viewpoint of the consumer. One question is, what is the consumer motivation? Right? Which means how much effort are they willing to put?
Right.
There will obviously be distribution, but at an average level, what is the consumer motivation to put it? How much are? The second is, what are the jobs to be done for a consumer? Right? What I've realized from a lot of these alternate MBA kind of model, including Stoas, what people are looking for what they're looking for is a learning community. Not many people are looking for career transitions. Now, if you superimpose that, if you impose that job to be done forcefully into the program, of course, your compliance rates are going to be low.
Right.
But when people come from full-time program, right, you have a large skin in the very high skin in the game. Correct. Right? Like, you have parked yourself for a year or two. Correct. At a campus. You have taken on a loan.
Right.
And when we started Stoa, a lot of times we considered that loan to be a bad thing.
Right.
But sometimes we also think maybe that is a good thing because that keeps people motivated.
Correct. You have skin.
कि वो EMI है, तो भी मेहनत करना है, right? Like I want to progress in career. Right. So I think full-time programs, they force people to have more skin in the game, and people who are really serious about career transitions, for them, like, full-time programs work better, right? And curious to serious, right? Like we have this sort of scale. When it comes to business education or any learning for that matter, when it comes to adult learning, there is a curious to serious scale. तो curious वाले से तुम उतना ही डिमांड कर सकते हो जो उसको curious रहे. Like, you can't demand the same level of commitment that you would ask from somebody who is looking for very serious outcomes.
Right. So I think, like, for very serious outcomes, probably offline will continue to be at play, and for, I think, others, it will be a mix between online versus hybrid of sorts. Got it.
There are people who have certain constraints, right? They can't do full time.
Right.
But their motivation, of course, is at par. So they would figure out how to derive value even from an online program.
Correct. Got it. And again, talking about, startups and like both edtechs and startup overall as an ecosystem, right? Startup jobs used to be seen as a very risky thing until few years ago. And then off late, the perception was starting to change in the last few years. But then again, this year, we've seen there's been some 15,000 plus layoffs, 7,000-8,000 just from edtech as a space. I think two things there that I wanted to end up discuss. One was, how is the student or a young professional's perception changed over startups as a job scenario? And second, from an edtech specific scenario, we've seen that the last 1 year hasn't been that great. How has that played out for Stoa, let's say, as an organization, which is also working in somewhat similar space?
We haven't been affected because the thing about Stoa was पहले भी हमको किसी ने घोड़े पे नहीं चढ़ाया और हमको किसी ने उतारा भी. So we have been going at our own pace since we raised our seed round, right? So we have been very conservative about staying cash flow positive, even though we had raised funds and so on and so forth. In fact, we did not start doing any performance ads until like 3-4 months back. And we did that for last 3-4 months back. We burnt our fingers. We are now immediately scaling back, right? Because we think that is not the way we want to grow the brand, grow the revenue, etc., etc. So Stoa, I don't think we are growing very fast. Let's say like a VC business is expected to do, but we are doing about 20-30% quarter on quarter growth. I think we are happy with that. Now, coming back to perceptions about startup jobs, of course, there are all these, startups are inherently volatile, right? Like, so when they pay well, and then when these kind of situations arise, they arise. But the fact of the matter is there is still talent scarcity.
Hmm.
If you were to go out and market and say, I want to hire a great performance marketeer,
Right.
even today in EdTech, everybody will tell you the same 4-5 names.
Correct. Yes.
Who have worked at maybe Upgrad or this or
Right.
that. वही 4-5 नाम है.
Correct.
Even though there are so many EdTechs, finding a great performance marketer for an EdTech company today is still very difficult.
Right.
And you take that even for product management, you take it across any of these roles. A good founders office person, a good chief of staff,
Right.
a good product manager, a good biz ops guy, they are always difficult to find.
Correct.
Right? So the talent scarcity is still there. So if you are competent, I don't think all of these things matter. You will still keep doing well. But of course, from a perception, thoda fear to aa jata hai, right? Like, so people who are on the fence, who don't understand, like, whose understanding of startup ecosystem is very what they read in TOI probably, right? Like,
Right.
I'm not blaming them. I'm just saying that
Right.
who don't understand the inherent risk-reward equation of a startup, they are, of course, not willing to participate in the ecosystem as much as they would have been, let's say, a year or two back. But anybody who is who fairly understands the risk-reward of being in the startup ecosystem, they understand the game, right?
Correct.
Like, it is about amateur versus whatever, professional.
I think just one last question, which I think we generally ask to all our guests, is what has been some of the most interesting conversations that you've heard, either inside or outside of a massive in classroom.
What I have been very intrigued by is how many people write on LinkedIn about their experience, right? And I was just discussing with Raj today morning. In one way, it is really good because it allows people to project their competence, right? Like, when I see a nicely written LinkedIn post, it tells me that this person writes well. And if he writes well, it is very likely that he or she thinks well, right? So it helps in building employer perception, right? But on the other side, I was also telling Raj about how this would be perceived by traditional recruiters, or especially people who come from pedigreed colleges. Like, अरे मेरे IIM के लोग तो नहीं लिखते हैं, ये लोग लिख रहे हैं Stoa वाले, या like, the challengers always have this problem, which is you want to build a brand, you want to project that your students are competent just like anyone else,
right?
But there are still mindsets,
right,
which would people would not perceive it positively. So I'm very impressed by how people are writing about their experience, how their evaluation was and what they're working on. And I see some great content coming out of, Masters Union. I have also gotten on call since my last session at Masters Union. I got on a call with a couple of people. It was very interesting to see like a bunch of founders who had taken a step back from entrepreneurship and want to go back to, founding a company again. So that motivation is still there. I'm taking a step back, but let me take this time to figure out what to do next.
I think, like you said, when we were discussing earlier, that but when you do it and then you realize, okay, I'm enjoying this and I want to do this again, or I want to do it in a refined way. I think that has been the idea for us also, that once you get an experiential experience of something, be it marketing, be it product, be it business, then I think you realize of where your strength lies and what you really want to kind of pursue. Great. So I think this has been great talking to you, Aditya. Thanks a lot for taking out the time.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.